Did Jesus claim to be God? Well, he never said that he was God. He never stated outright, I am Yahweh. But he did say and do things that left first century Jews with one inescapable option. Jesus knew who he was, God incarnate. Listen, Jesus never said outright that he was God. This is true. But he did say and do things that underscored the truth of who he was and who he is even today. And what I want to do is give you 3 examples where Jesus says and does things that compelled his Jewish audience to draw one conclusion. And that conclusion is that Jesus was God incarnate. I'm going to look at 3 examples where 1, Jesus forgives sins, then 2, where he corrects Moses, and then the 3rd example will be where Jesus calms the storm. And as we look at these 3 examples, here's what I need for you to do. You need to keep the cultural context in the back of your mind. You need to keep it there. You need to stop looking at the Bible with a 21st century modern worldview, because if you do, you will miss a lot of what is going on. You need to get into your head what a first century Jew would have thought. And as we look at these examples, it's going to help you understand why these Jews were left with one inescapable option when Jesus did and say the things that he did. He is going to point to the fact, even without saying that he's God, that in fact he is God. So let's look at these 3 examples. Let's begin with the first one where Jesus forgives sin. You are probably familiar with that story in Mark's Gospel in chapter 2, where that lame man is lowered from the roof before Jesus, a man that's unable to walk. You immediately would think that when Jesus sees this man, he would say to him, well, you're healed. But that is not what Jesus did. What Jesus first does is tell the man that his sins are forgiven. And the moment he does that, the scribes that were in the audience that day react accordingly. They know that what Jesus has done, in their understanding, and it was true, he had blasphemed. And blaspheming was punishable by death. But Mark records what happens next. This is what he writes. Jesus, perceiving in his spirit that they thus questioned within themselves, said to them, why do you question these things in your heart? Which is easier, to say to the paralytic, your sins are forgiven, or to say, rise, take up your bed and walk? But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. The scribes were in their right position when they questioned Jesus' ability to forgive sins. They were right in believing what they were thinking, because according to their scriptures, the only one who could absolve someone of their sin was God himself. And for Jesus to be able to do this, they were left with one inescapable conclusion. This man believes that in fact he is God. He is doing something that only God could do. They knew what the scriptures said. They knew what David said when he wrote in Psalm 51, against you, and you only have I sinned, and done that which is evil in your sight. And here's Jesus telling this man, your sins are forgiven. And note, Jesus says to them, which is easier, to say that your sins are forgiven, or to heal the man, to say to him, rise up and walk? Note what Jesus says, which is easier. In other words, it doesn't matter which one I do. I can do both, and I can do them without any effort. You and I, we cannot say to a sick person, be healed, and they are healed. You and I, we cannot say to a human being, we or you or I forgive you of your sins. I absolve you of all your sin. But God can and does. Not only can God heal you and me, but God does, in fact, forgive us, that is, absolve us of all our sin. Both acts are easy for God. which is why Jesus said, which is easier, to say your sins are forgiven or to say rise up and walk? What Jesus was doing was showing the crowd that day, I'm not what you think I am. I am someone far greater. I know who I am, God incarnate. Let's go to the second example. This is the example where Jesus corrects Moses. Now, this is an example that probably a lot of you may not be aware of. But in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus has pulled his disciples up on the hillside and he's teaching them, the crowds have gathered all around and they're listening as well. But in the Sermon on the Mount, you have these famous 6 antitheses where Jesus says, you have heard that it was said to those of old, but I say to you. 6 times Jesus says, you have heard that it was said to those of old, but I say to you. What Jesus is doing in these 6 antitheses, he is either correcting the interpretation of the law of Moses, or in fact, he is taking it to a whole nother level. He is saying, you have heard what Moses have said, but now this is what I am saying to you. Now, this would have been a shock to his audience, and this, again, is why you need to get this cultural context into your thinking. Moses was regarded by the Jews of Jesus' day as a divine man. He was the Theos Aner, the God-man, if you will. This is a man who is so close to God that divinity was believed to have flown through him. This one was considered to be higher than all other human beings. He was the highest in the Jewish world other than God himself. And for for Jesus to correct Moses, oh my goodness, to correct the God-man, Jesus was claiming to be divine because there was no one higher than Moses but Yahweh himself. And now Jesus is saying to them, you have heard of old that which was said, but I say to you, now something new that is here. When Jesus finished teaching, by the way, when he'd finished the Sermon on the Mount, you note that Matthew records that the crowds were astonished. They were astonished at his teaching because he was one who claimed to have authority. He was teaching as one who had authority that was unlike the scribes who they were used to hearing teach. The reason why they were so astonished is because the scribes of Jesus' day were amazing name droppers. They would appeal to one rabbi after another to back up what they were saying, rabbis that had lived long before them. But Jesus didn't name drop that way. Jesus claimed to be the authority. You have heard that it was said of old, but I say to you. Jesus knew who he was. He was God incarnate. And then there's a third example. This is where Jesus calms the storm. Now again, you are probably familiar with this account. This is when Jesus was in the boat in the Sea of Galilee, and he has fallen asleep. And while he is sleeping, a windstorm suddenly arises. And the sea, that is the waters in which this boat is found, are now going back and forth. This little boat is being tossed all over the place. In fact, it begins to fill with water. And this is when the disciples awaken Jesus, telling him, hey, we are perishing. And then Luke records this as to what Jesus said. And he awoke and rebuked the wind and the raging waves, and they ceased, and there was calm. And he said to them, where is your faith? And they were afraid, and they marveled, saying to one another, who then is this, that he commands even winds and water, and they obey him? These disciples marveled at what had happened. They were astonished at what had happened. In fact, they were afraid once the seas had calmed down because they had seen Jesus do something incredibly powerful, and they knew their Bible. They knew that in Psalm 107, the psalmist is telling the readers to rejoice, to give thanks to God for he is good. And then the psalmist recounts a particular instance where God's goodness was seen where sailors who found themselves in raging seas, the seas were suddenly calmed by Yahweh himself. These sailors saw the great works of Yahweh, and the psalmist records what the sailors saw Yahweh do. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad that the waters were quiet, and he brought them to their desired haven. Jesus was doing the exact same thing that Yahweh was doing. Jesus calmed the raging wind and sea. The very power of Yahweh that the psalmist is talking about, these disciples have now seen Jesus do the very same thing, and they could not miss the parallel, that what they are seeing is one who is like Yahweh. In fact, even the pagans themselves would have recognized and what was going on here, because you got to understand, back in that time, they had all types of gods, and in the Greco-Roman world, there were certain gods that were more powerful than others, and these were the gods that ruled the winds and ruled the seas. The Roman god Jupiter, or his counterpart Zeus, ruled the wind. And then you had Neptune, or his Greek counterpart Poseidon, who ruled the water. The winds and the water were their domains, and yet here is one who now has calmed both. In essence, what Jesus was doing, he is telling the two most powerful gods in the Greco-Roman pantheon, hey, sit down. You are outranked. I'm in charge. I'm in control. And it's no wonder that the disciples marveled at what Jesus had done when he calmed both the sea, that is, calming the wind and the waves. It says they marveled, but it also says they were afraid. This is interesting because you would think now that the waters are calm, now that the boat is not filling with water, why would they be afraid? Let me tell you the reason why they were afraid is because they are now looking at this man Jesus and realizing, oh my, there is more here than what we understood. We are seeing the very power of Yahweh in play, and we're seeing it in and through this one called Jesus. Listen, Jesus knew who he was, God incarnate. And when you're reading in the Gospels, you're going to see things that Jesus says and things that Jesus does that points to this very truth. Yes, Jesus did not outright say, I am God. I am Yahweh. But he did do and say a great many things that pointed to the fact that he knew who he was. He was God incarnate, God in human flesh on the earth. Hey, listen, thanks so much for joining me today. I hope this has been helpful as always. And if it has, if you would, just hit the like button. And again, if you've not become a subscriber, would you please hit that subscription button as well? I'd like for you to come on board. But again, so glad that you were with me today. And as I always like to say, and I mean this, God's very, very best to you.